And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Flying weather for tomorrow morning. We've got good VFR central interior on up to at least the western Arctic coast, some marginal VFR on the east side. And marginal VFR here with some areas of IFR across southern Alaska. And IFR there, Pribilof Islands, Bering Sea, pretty good swath of VFR, Adak and Atka off to the northwest. Otherwise marginal VFR into Bristol Bay. And a lot of IFR here along the southeast coast, Yakutat on down into the Panhandle. And then for the afternoon, IFR, Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, and then down the coastline of the southeast coast with marginal VFR over the inside waters. So marginal VFR, Cook Inlet here up into Turnagain, Knik Arm areas down to Kamishak Bay. And about Fognak Island, Kodiak Island, mostly marginal VFR, northern Sitna Valley there into the Copper River Basin. Big chunk of the southwest interior, marginal on up to the Seward Peninsula with marginal VFR right along the Arctic coast. But the North Slope looking pretty good with VFR for the afternoon. Out west, still a big chunk of VFR here over the southern Bering Sea into the eastern Aleutians. And the IFR northward there, right over the Pribilof Islands, otherwise staying south in Nunivak Island, St. Matthew Island. And for Monday morning, a big increase in IFR here in the Bering Sea, right into the southwest interior. A lot of IFR for the North Slope and the Arctic coast. VFR holding there, northern Seward Peninsula, Selawik Valley, in across much of the interior. Along and south of the Alaska Range, marginal VFR becomes IFR down along the Kenai Peninsula, Kodiak Island in the Gulf there. Solid IFR for the southeast coast. And then for Monday afternoon, IFR over the northern Panhandle, otherwise IFR along the coastline. Marginal VFR mostly here across southern Alaska. Interior mostly VFR, North Slope VFR, some marginal stuff along the Brooks Range, and marginal VFR there for the Arctic coast. And again, a band of IFR here holding out over the Bering Sea, right over the Pribilof Islands, and VFR to the south for the eastern Aleutians to about Atka, Adak westward, lower conditions, mostly marginal though with the IFR staying just to the south. And for passes, Anatufik and Atigan, another VFR day coming up there for both of those passes in the Brooks Range. Western Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill, chance of IFR tomorrow at times, otherwise marginal, call it marginal for rainy. And windy, also looking marginal. Isabel, marginal VFR. Mentasta, marginal VFR, mainly on the southern entrance, better to the north. And for Tanita, marginal VFR. Portage, mostly marginal. Chilkoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels, 4,000 feet here, kind of slipping eastward now, that upper level low over the southwest interior, right into western Cook Inlet. 6,000 feet here up across the Kenai Peninsula, and then 8,000 feet from the Brooks Range out to the Arctic coast. 12,000 feet in over the Panhandle. Icing, not much out here over the west for the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. The biggest area up here, considerable moderate for the Arctic coast into the North Slope on down to Cape Lisburne and Point Hope. Also here for the Yukon Delta with isolated moderate rime icing in across Kuskokwim Valley, south central Alaska, right on down into the Alaska Peninsula and over the northern southeast coast. Jet stream with that upper level low pulling eastward here right over the southwest interior, bringing the colder air aloft with it. Got easterly winds 65 knots, Seward Peninsula, southerlies 95 knots into the eastern North Gulf Coast, right across the Alaska Copper River Basin and the eastern Alaska Range. Lighter under high pressure over the southern Panhandle. Out here to the west, 110 knot winds there blowing across the eastern Aleutians. 9,000 feet, again, at this elevation, the low center near Norton Sound. 40 knot winds, mainly out of the east on the north side of that, coming around westerly 40 to 45 knots across the Alaska Peninsula. South 45 knots in over the eastern interior, and up to 50 knots there coming just north of Yakutat. And at 3,000 feet, south winds 30 knots there along the central coast of the Panhandle. Otherwise, pretty brisk west-northwest winds, 30 to 40 knots here coming across the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, and 35-knot winds right over the lower Yukon River Valley and Delta area. North 40 knots, though, for the Bering Strait and the central Arctic coast. And from there, looking at turbulence, light to isolated moderate turbulence expected for the central and western Arctic coast. Wainwright on down to Point Lake, Cape Lisburne, Point Hope to the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island with a moderate turbulence expected down here over the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, right on up into northeast Bristol Bay, east side of Kodiak Island to Kamishak Bay, as well as the southeast coast up to Yakutat over to about Cordova.